my notebook, the underside of my soul released in scribbles on pages. He smiled and held my hand and knew that he would.
So yes, today we're going to talk about notebooks. Notebooks broadly construed, not so much the notebook that you took to class in your analog adolescence and tried to write down things that were being said, but the notebooks that have been used over centuries to record human activity. Notebooks that effectively, if the brain is a hard drive, notebooks that effectively acted like flash drives or thumb drives, a place where you could maybe even put down the stuff that your brain wouldn't store. And that obviously goes on today. In fact, in my case, my brain is storing less and less. And it's certainly the case that anything I put in there squeezes out something else. So I probably ought to get into the notebook habit. But we have a great reason to do this. And I'm not just, saying this to be nice or something, which I probably wouldn't do anyway. But this book that has occasioned our conversation today, The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland Allen. It's just terrific. Lily Tyson and I have been having so much fun getting ready for this show. And now here's Roland Allen himself, book publisher and author in particular of The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Roland Allen, welcome to our show.
Oh, hello. Yeah, it's great to be with you.
So, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that one might imagine that, and maybe before we even say anything, we should have a moment of silence for all the moles who gave up their skin so that we could have notebooks. So thank you, moles. Thanks. But one would think that somewhere around the invention of paper and the promulgation of paper, which is kind of the caliphate, it's 800 AD, it's Baghdad. You'd think, well, people are just going to start having notebooks. They're going to start writing things down in notebooks. But as far as you can tell, that doesn't really happen for hundreds and hundreds of years. Say some more about that.
Well, I'm pretty confident, actually, that it does happen. And there are good reasons to think why. But the problem is that very, very few of those notebooks survive. And I really, really struggled to find early Arabic or Islamic or Persian notebooks, despite the fact that Baghdad was absolutely full of books. We know that they bound up paper into books like we have. They didn't just use scrolls or loose sheets. So I'm pretty confident that they did use notebooks. But what we see later on is a lot of notebooks suddenly surviving and being used in really, I think, quite exciting new ways.
Yeah, and so a lot of that starts in Florence. Florence becomes a center of business. The business lives on notebooks or in notebooks and kind of begins to help create a kind of parallel culture of notebooks. But say a little bit more about that, too.
Well, Florence, this is about the year 1300 or so, or a bit before. I think it's one of the most interesting places in the world at this point. So what you've got is an immensely rich merchant and banking class who are really, really successful, really international, really plugged into all kinds of trading networks across Europe and into Asia. So you've got that bringing in lots of cash. And the way they're doing it is not with armies, not colonizing anywhere, not going Viking style and stealing stuff. They're doing it by being better at managing the money that they have. And the tool that they use for that is the notebook. And if you like, that could be the hardware, and the software that they have is double entry bookkeeping in particular. So at this moment in time, they are inventing basically accountancy, the trade of accountancy and bookkeeping and financial direction, pretty much as it is still practiced today.
I think one of the fascinating figures early in your book is a gentleman we call Michael of Rhodes. And there's so many things about him that are very interesting. But the first thing is that he is, by birth, a commoner. He starts out as a galley oarsman, which would be a pretty unglamorous, low-prestige gig. And he winds up being this just, very, very multifarious notebook keeper, somebody who really has a lot of interests and produces this really remarkable notebook, probably the first one written by somebody who wasn't of noble birth, like written and preserved anyway. But tell us a little bit more about Michael.
I'm so glad you picked up on him. So his name was Michael of Rhodes, and he lived in Venice around the year 1400 and onwards. And as you say, we don't know exactly where he came from, but we know it was pretty low on the social scale. Some people even think he was possibly a slave. And the fact that he was called Michael of Rhodes suggests that he was Greek, not Venetian himself. And he just improved himself. And a lot of people who've studied his notebook, myself included, basically have fallen in love with this guy who's been dead for 6 centuries because he has such a great go-getting attitude. He's interested in mathematics, he's interested in astrology, in shipbuilding, in trade. And he rises through the ranks of the Venetian Navy, which is the sort of big trading fleet of Europe at this point. And eventually he's in charge of fleets himself, and he goes as high as it's possible to go in the Venetian system without actually being a noble born. And so it's a great sort of story of social climbing and success and ambition. And he records it all in his notebook. And personally, I mean, one of the most fascinating little things in it is he keeps his resume in it. So each year, just a few lines he writes about the voyages that he goes on, the captain he sails with, the ships he was on, where he went and for how long. So it's a very minimal record, but it shows how he sailed east to fight in battles against the Turks. He sailed west all the way as far as London and Bruges, really, really long distances for the time. He had a really remarkable life, and it's all there in this book, which is in part a resume, and in part it's full of maths problems because he was just fascinated by arithmetic.
We should say, like, the first 180 pages are just math problems.
Yeah, and I think the reason he had them all written down there was partly to educate himself and to entertain himself, but partly to show off to people who he came across the amount of numeracy he had. And I think in some ways it was his calling card when he was going for a new job. He had to reapply for his position every year before the fleets set sail. And I think that the book was sort of the way he would present himself as a self-educated man, as someone who could be trusted to make good decisions and so on. So it's a really fascinating record of this life, which we wouldn't really imagine. You know, if you invented Michael of Rhodes, no one would really believe you.
But somebody should do a historical novel about Michael of Rhodes. Yeah, and I think some of the fascination of notebooks like this, and we'll talk about some other people who fit into this category, is it's like, we know what you did. You wrote a book about notebooks. It's not clear what some of these notebook keepers are thinking that they're doing. Are they just kind of downloading their memories onto the page? Are they, as you say, maybe, keeping resumes and trying to impress people? I mean, the motive of the notebook keeper might be one thing. It might be a lot of different things, but it's not always clear, right?
Absolutely. And it really varies. So some of my favorite notebooks are Zibaldoni, which are these fun collections of poetry and prayers and stories, which people keep in Florence. And this is before the printed book. So if you wanted to have literature in your home, if you wanted to have something to read, someone had to copy it out. And if you weren't rich enough to employ a scribe to do that, then you had to copy it out yourself. And that's what people did in these Zibaldonis. So it reminds me of the notebooks I used to keep when I was a teenager, when I would write down song lyrics, which particularly appealed to me, or sometimes use them as a scrapbook. So those are a lot of fun.
I do. We're going to have to sort of speed date through some of the really illustrious notebook keepers and note takers. And one of them that you spend quite a bit of time with is Charles Darwin. Darwin is, I think, 22 when he signs on for this voyage that lasts for 5 years. In fact, it lasts so long he didn't really bring enough notebooks. But one of the things I love about Charlie Darwin is that one of the biographers who spent the most time with these really raw notebooks said that they were, in his words, the worst. Explain,
yeah, absolutely.
Explain what he means by the worst.
These notebooks weren't intended for anyone else. What they were Charles Darwin going ashore from the HMS Beagle in places like Brazil or the Falkland Islands or famously the Galapagos, and just taking notes on everything he saw pretty much as he saw it. So if he saw a particular rock formation, he'd make a quick sketch. If he saw a particular bird, he'd make a very quick description, just a few words, or a lizard or a sea urchin or a beetle. He loved beetles, all this kind of thing. But it's really, really scrappy notes. I don't think there's any punctuation in any of his working field notebooks like that, but it didn't matter at all how scrappy they were. Because when he got back onto the Beagle at night and started moving his notes into more organized notebooks and checking what he'd written against other reference works and things like that, he started developing his observations, if you like, and then developing theories to fit observations with amazing results. So the fact that these notebooks are horrible little scribbly things really didn't matter at all.
Right. He's gonna do a kind of secondary version of them, and really so dramatically. I don't know if this is common knowledge. I certainly didn't know it, but one of the notebooks he just writes, I think, at the top of the page. I think this is a chapter title for you too. I think, and then there's that tree of life drawing. What an incredibly kind of dramatic way to do that in a notebook. I think.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing.
And he kept, this is a habit which stayed with him throughout his life. He would keep a notebook in his pocket, just ready to always jot down the idea that he had. So when he wrote that, we don't know exactly when he did write it, but he was probably on the hoof, and he was probably, quite spontaneously thinking and writing at the same time. And it's amazing that that one has survived and come down to us as a record of that moment.
All right. I said we're going to speed date. Let's jump over to, I think in some people's memories, or if I said to a reasonably well-educated person, we're going to do a show about notebooks/diaries. Here in America, we have this thing that we talk about all the time now, the GOAT, the greatest of all time. I think a lot of people would say Samuel Pepys is the greatest of all time. But I'm even going to just indulge your patience by reading you to you right now, describing Pepys. A masterpiece. He talks about the diary that a masterpiece that combined the self-examination of the ancient Greeks, the daily confession of medieval monks, the financial accounting of the Florentines, the public affairs of Martin Sanudo, the travel observations that Francis Bacon recommended, the trivial detail that Johnson, I think that's Ben Jonson, had lampooned, and like another person you just mentioned, the discord of an unhappy marriage. And then you write that Pepys also wrote about his sex life, crudely disguising those passages by rendering them in a combination of bad Italian, Spanish, and French, which did equal violence to all three languages. And then you even give us a sample of this, and it is just hilarious. But talk about, Pepys is just kind of an amazing source for historians of the period. But he'll kind of write down just about anything, as you suggest in that passage.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the main thing about Pepys is zero filter. It helps that he was a fascinating guy who had a really interesting job. He had a very interesting cultural life. He knew all sorts of fascinating people, and he traveled a lot. But really, the main spell his diaries cast is that there's nothing between you and him, really. If he thinks it, he writes it down. Again, you get to know him. You really get to like him, I think. It's early in the day where you are, aren't you? So we can't really talk about some of the details, but he really did not filter what he put in there. And you're right, he becomes the main historical source for everything he sees, just because he writes down about the shape of people's hats, the plays that he sees, the cheeses that he eats, all of the detail goes in. So we know how he lived completely.
Let's do one or two more very quickly. I'm going to get in trouble with Lily Tyson, but just because I'm sitting here in Hartford, Connecticut, we have to mention that Mark Twain, for whom I think everything was performative. I don't think there were many things that Samuel Clemens just thought, nobody else will want to know about this. So he's keeping these diaries while he's traveling, but he's using this really unusual kind of diary. Explain what this was.
So he had a diary which had carbon papers built into it. So when he wrote his diary, I'm sorry about the dog. When he wrote his diary, he kept two copies of it, and I think he would send one back home to his wife, so she would know what he was up to, and he kept his own record. So there was always a duplicate of what he was writing.
Yeah, I mean, this is, by the way, the dog's great. We like it when dogs are on the show, so don't apologize. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like, yeah, he's sending, one copy home to Livy or something, but he also, he's thinking about this already.
Yeah,
It's like,
absolutely. And I think it's always the first draft of what he ends up
right.
publishing.
The Efron sisters had a saying in their family, everything is copy, by which they meant, whatever happens to you, I mean, it might seem bad even at the time, but it's going to turn into something. And I think for Twain, everything is copy too. I want to just jump from here quickly, just because we are pressed for time. I've always been aware of the Florida politician, Bob Graham. I guess I didn't really know about this whole thing he did. First of all, this whole thing he did where he literally worked at other people's jobs a full day at, I think, 100 different jobs in Florida, but also started keeping a fairly meticulous record of what that was like.
Yeah, and this it's quite an inspiring story, I think, because you want your politicians to know what real life is like for real people. And then we sort of trust that they're going to do the right thing on behalf of those real people. So he worked on, I don't know, fishing boats. He bussed tables. He worked in cloakrooms in hotels. I mean, he drove trucks. He really did every sort of ordinary, everyday kind of job.
He's like the Michael of Rhodes of Florida.
Yeah, exactly. He picked fruit. And the reason he started keeping notebooks was because he literally met so many people who had things to tell him that writing them down was the only thing he could possibly do. This turned into a really meticulous minute-by-minute record of his entire day, which he carried on all the way through being Florida governor and then into the Senate. And it's just incredible, the level of detail of his life, again, that he recorded, but it's fascinating.
But then his, journalists and perhaps political enemies tried to turn this against him, to kind of said there's something a little cuckoo about this. So this is just weird, particularly the amount of detail and the specificity and what's going. I mean, they really try to make it into a negative about him.
Yeah, they did. Interestingly, it wasn't the Florida media who did this. They kind of accepted it probably because they saw more of him. But it's when he became a national figure that people, as you say, people thought it was a really strange thing to do. And they didn't see the upside, I think, because they didn't know him as well as the Floridians did. But yeah, and I think people treated him quite unfairly as a result. There's a case to be said. I think it's fair to say he would have had a shot at certainly VP if it hadn't been for his notebook habit, because people really judged him for it.
It's so odd. All right, we're going to grab a quick break here. We're talking to Roland Allen about his book, The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. We'll be back with more.
The world and hurricane. Who could heed the words of Charlie Darwin? I found her diary underneath the tree and started reading about me. The words she'd written took me by surprise.
So we're talking to Roland Allen, book publisher and author of The Notebook. That's the name of the book, The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Let's go a little bit more into the present here. There's so much in this book, and I feel bad that we can't get to all of it, but I really do recommend people read it, because reading about the notebooks is also reading about the world at all the different times when these notebooks are being created and compiled. But I want to go into the present. In a way, the thing that blew me away emotionally in this book the most, because I didn't know about it, is the relatively modern idea of patient diaries. These are odd in the sense that they're not what they sound like. They are not, for the most part, diaries written by patients. Explain, and you might even want to use the example of the gentleman being cared for and in intensive care for COVID.
Yeah, well, as I wrote this book, it was COVID. I wrote much of it during lockdown. And this actually chapter, it's interesting that you pick up on this chapter. A lot of people highlight it as one that particularly touched them. And for me, it was also an amazing one to write because it was the first chapter, I think, in the book where I wrote it quite early in the process. And it was the first chapter I felt that really worked, that I found my voice and that I interviewed someone as well. And he had a really interesting story to tell. So I spoke to Michael Rosen, who's a British poet, and he got COVID really badly. And he was sent into the intensive care unit, the ICU. And obviously he was knocked out. You get put into a coma in an ICU. But what we don't realize is that this itself is really, really bad for you. Being put under, as you have to be in those circumstances, and ventilated is terrible for your mental health. You can often get PTSD, depression, hallucinations, all kinds of delusions when you come around. It's a very, very profoundly confusing experience. So they came up with the idea of the patient diary, which is ideally kept by the nurses who look after you or the physicians who treat you. But typically it's the nurses, and they write a diary to you, telling you what they have done for you that day, what you've experienced that day, even though you've been in a coma, in effect, and what they feel you might be feeling or thinking. And then the next day they do it again and again and again. And when you're looking at COVID, for instance, where people were under for weeks at a time while their bodies fought this infection, all of that time which they'd lost, when they get the patient diary, it gets given back to them. And it's like this void in their life, which for a lot of people can be really traumatic, gets filled with this thing, which is an expression of care. And it's a really profoundly moving experience, I think. And Michael Rosen spoke about it as being a real act of love, or rather the proof of all of these acts of love, which the nurses had, at great risk to themselves, carried out while he was, horribly infectious and required 24-hour care. Yeah, so patient diaries are really, really deep and I think really moving things.
This really tugged at my own heart just because my partner in life had a similar experience. One of the early COVID patients and a lot of complications. She was in the hospital for 10 months and nobody did this for her. Eventually, when we got in there, we could start kind of creating oral records, but for a long time, you couldn't visit a COVID patient. You couldn't visit any patient at all in a hospital because of lockdown. So it was, and she has, I think, a lot of what you described there, this feeling that she doesn't really remember what happened, and a lot of it seems almost like a dream. And as you say, there's this syndrome, which I've always been fascinated by, although I may not know how to pronounce it correctly. I always say Capgras syndrome. This is this belief that the people around you have been replaced by imposters, including your loved ones are now imposters or maybe extraterrestrials or something. And that apparently does happen in these cases, particularly if the person isn't given the real context of what happened.
Yeah, and it sounds utterly terrifying. And one of the most common delusions is that the people who are caring for you are actually trying to kill you. So they become these kind of faceless automatons or robots who mean you harm. And it must be so terrifying to be under those circumstances. I mean, it's really, really, to think about it, it's quite painful.
Yeah, the idea of the diaries are wonderful. Let's go to a more positive thing. Every action creates a reaction, and one of the reactions to digital culture has been a kind of reversion to analog. Diaries, and particularly, branded diaries and things like that, have become very, very popular, very hip, at least in a certain contingent. I even discovered today that there are YouTube sites where they review like the new Luke Term diary or where they say the moleskins aren't as good as they used to be, and here's why, and they page through them, they hold them up to the camera and everything, which seems very odd to do on YouTube to be talking so explicitly about something that you write in. But just talk a little bit about how the diary has a kind of status, or the notebook has a kind of status today.
I think what we're seeing is a kind of rebound, particularly when the iPad came in, but also in, the iPhone or any of the tablets or laptops. We immediately gravitated towards them because they were shiny and new, and they offered us all of these amazing functions, which a notebook can't match at all, in terms of capacity or watching video or browsing on the internet. And then we find out that actually these things don't work quite as well for the very simple note-taking jobs, which are either educational or professional or creative or just to do with living slightly more efficiently around the house, shopping lists and the like. For those really simple tasks, a paper notebook actually, it seems, works better. And this is what the psychologists have found when they've looked into it, that taking notes by hand means that you understand the information that much better, you retain it and recall it much better, and so on. And I think this is definitely a trend. And at the same time, what we're seeing, as you say, is this kind of slight fetishizing of upmarket notebooks when people really do care. And I count myself among these people. I really care about my notebooks bindings. I won't have a Moleskine or a Leuchtturm next to me at the moment. I will exclusively use Japanese ones, which are much more to my current. Yeah, you're laughing at me. That's not kind.
I'm laughing at you very affectionately right now, Roland. I actually do have some Leuchtturm experience. Leuchtturm is in my life even now. So,
I've got a stack of them myself. I don't want to knock them.
Right. But the other thing that you're saying is really important. I don't want it to be glossed over. We're going to have to wrap it pretty soon. But I offer you this, that the songwriter Johnny Mercer used to tell singers to write out the lyrics by hand. I think in particular his lyrics, but in general, it was a good practice because you understand it better. Even if you know the lyric from heart, you write it out in your handwriting because something else happens there. There's an alchemy that goes on. And I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. When you take that, when you put the labor into writing something out by hand, and a song lyric is a really good example, it forces you to concentrate on the construction of the line, on where the prepositions are, on where the line breaks are, on the rhymes, or the rhymes nouns and nouns, or nouns and verbs, all these kind of details, which, as you say, you don't think about when you're singing along in the car. But when you write it down and you concentrate on the elements, suddenly you see the artistry that's gone into it. And I think the same applies to poetry or to good prose as well.
Oh, absolutely. This is just a wonderful book, and I've enjoyed this conversation so much, too. The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland Allen. We really recommend it. There's also a lot of beautiful illustrations in there, samplings of pictures of people, but also samplings of some of the notebooks that we've talked about here today, too. So, first of all, thank you for the book, and thank you for being here today.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And we are going to take a little break here, but wonderful people, I don't really know specifically who they are, but just generally speaking, wonderful people are going to ask you to support this enterprise and all the other enterprises surrounding us. And so please do that. We're almost at the end of this pledge drive, but we need to do well.
Take totes of the marijuana smoke, relax and take no gun smoke. I just want the paper. I just want the paper. I just want the paper. I just want the paper.
I believe I am back, and it is time to say some thank yous and give some credit where credit is due, starting with the maestro, Dylan Reyes. He's our technical producer. The senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show is Lily Tyson. She produced this episode. Also want to say hi to Mike and Karen. They are visiting us in the control room, which is some kind of prize they won. Which raises the question, what was first prize? Because it couldn't possibly have been this. Also, thanks to, actually, we should thank our bosses every day because they're really great bosses, Meg Dalton and Robin Doyen-Aiken. Thanks to both of them. And we are now going to spend the final segment kind of doing what Roland said that maybe is not almost possible. And that is the use of the Notes app on your phone as a kind of notebook. And here to tell, we're also going to, if we have time, talk about commonplace books, which we didn't have time to do with Roland. Here to help us with all of that is Charlie Locke, a journalist, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, recently wrote Keep Your Notes app Under Lock and Key for The Atlantic. Charlie Locke, welcome to our conversation.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So I'm very old, extremely old. And so as a result, I mean, I'm aware of that app on my phone, and I've sort of looked at it once or twice and maybe opened it when there was something I was really sure I probably wasn't going to remember. But I was shocked to find out that two of the people that I just named, especially, no, I think both of them, I think Lily Tyson and Meg Dalton, are just doing all kinds of things with that Notes app. Maybe just for people like me, explain how it even works. What for the people who never even opened it on their
Totally.
phones? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So it's basically like scratch paper that is included on your iPhone, excuse me, automatically. It's one of those apps that's there for everybody when you get an iPhone, and it is very intuitive. You just open it and you can just type stuff and it stays in a note there, and you can make multiple notes. And the way that I have found that people use it, and I use it this way too, although I'm definitely not a power user in the way that a lot of people I talk to for the Atlantic story are, is just kind of using it in the way that you would use a scratch pad of paper. They make grocery lists on it. You write down someone's contact information that you need to store somewhere. You write down something that you remember in the middle of the night that you have to scribble down, and your phone is on your nightstand. So it's just kind of a catch-all place for lots and lots of the daily ephemera of your life. But unlike a physical scratch pad, you're not throwing it away at the end of the day.
Nor is anyone discovering it accidentally. Or in other words,
Hopefully.
well, it's password protected. That's a good start anyway. So you do have a little bit of privacy. Yeah, one of the power users that you talk to, I think maybe everyone's favorite, was Kelsey McKinney, host of Normal Gossip, who uses the Notes app to draft novels. But my favorite line in your whole piece is about Kelsey McKinney doing a list tracking how many hot dogs she and some friends have eaten this year. And this is my favorite part: records of the offenses of her friends' enemies. So I don't know how
Yeah,
much
very thorough.
I don't know how much follow-up questions you asked about that, but it's apparently one friend who has enemies who do bad things. That's how you get to be somebody's enemy, I guess. And it's her job, not the friend, but it's Kelsey's job to write down the horrible things that they do in the Notes app.
Well, I think the way Kelsey explained it to me is it's her way of keeping track of why, kind of why people have wronged her friends and why she should dislike them because they've wronged her friends.
But I think also, just it's sort of an anti-gaslighting measure too, because sometimes we feel like somebody's being rotten to us, but then when we're asked to think about some proof of that, very few things pop into our minds. So I think it's got an anti-gaslighting function, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a noble way to look at it. She might appreciate that.
Yeah. Feel free to kick it over to her. But I mean, you said, hopefully, when I said not accessible to, people finding it and finding your innermost thoughts, isn't that a feature rather than a bug? I mean, it feels like, you could do this a lot of different ways, but one of the virtues of this is somebody would have to be able to get into your phone to find all this stuff.
Yeah, your phone or your computer, it all syncs up to people's computers too. And I think that yes, it is private in many ways, but also, if your phone is stolen, or if your friend, borrows your phone to make a phone call or whatever, it's also just there. So yes, in a way it is private, but it's not like a diary that has a little lock on it that you keep beneath your pillow. It's accessible to anyone who has your phone or computer, and all of us are really carrying that technology around all the time.
Right. I'm guessing many millennials, Gen Z, are the people who are kind of using it the most. But I think a lot of it is kind of the everything bagel quality of what's in there, right? I mean, it is very similar to some of the notebooks that Roland Allen writes about in his book, because rather than curation, it isn't really about curation, is it? It's just about getting stuff down where it can be seen again.
Yeah, totally.
And I would imagine that for some people, just the way a diary or a notebook or something, a physical one can be an opportunity to refresh one's memory about what happened 5 years ago. I mean, I think you write about the fact that some of these things go way back in time because this stuff kind of stays in there.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it can be really evocative in a kind of unexpected way to look back at the Notes app or something like it, because it's not It's not things that you wrote down imagining that in 10 years you'd look at this and reflect on your life through it. It's not really formal in the way that a diary can feel like you're making a diary entry, for future preservation. This is really just what you needed to write down in the moment. And so for me, I can look at my notes app, and I have notes from 15 years ago, from when I was in college, where I was writing down, just the daily ephemera of what I was doing, what I was shopping for, what I wanted to remember with my friends, what my inside jokes were. And I talked to some younger users too, who have had iPhones basically their whole lives and have notes in there from when they were 10 years old, which is just a crazy to have that kind of scratch pad of what you're doodling about or kind of thinking about from really young is pretty incredible.
Yeah, maybe even stuff from the womb. Like, it turns out looks like I'm not going to be a fish. I'm evolving. I'm changing in here. This is, although you describe yourself as not really a power user of the Notes app, but one thing that you do, which we didn't have time to talk to Roland about, but I think this is really interesting, and your attitudes toward it, I think, are very interesting, is the so-called commonplace book. These are books these are notebooks, but it's not so much the person writing down his or her or their thoughts. It's copying things out that you don't want to forget. But say a little bit more about what the commonplace book is, and then we'll talk about how you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a commonplace book is a notebook where you write down things that you have heard or read that you want to remember. And so the way that I use it, and I've used it since a college professor asked me to start keeping one, is to write down lines from things that I read, whether that is novels or magazine articles or poems, or sometimes lines that I overhear people saying that really strike me, that feel really meaningful and kind of touch a chord in me. And I write them down in these notebooks. I have multiple of them now. And it's kind of like a way of keeping the quotations that I find really important close at hand. And looking back on that, I find really meaningful because, I can look at a certain section of my commonplace book and see what felt like the really urgent issues and thinkers and ideas and way of articulating things from when I was, say, 22, and how much that feels different to me now. It's a really interesting way of looking at what feels really urgent and important from a certain time in my life.
Yeah, and I like I often like what he says about anything, but Nicholson Baker describes commonplace books. He says, "My own bristling brain urchins of worry melt in the strong solvent of other people's grammar."
That's a line that's worth putting in a commonplace book.
Exactly. If I had a commonplace book, I would write that down and put it in there. But I think it's also, one thing that you talk about, and this is a totally different piece that you wrote for the New York Times, I think, but is that there's a little bit less of the pressure of being the next Samuel Pepys, because you're not coming up with your own stuff, and you're also not talking about the time you had sex with the tailor's wife, which is something that he did write about in his diary. I wasn't just making that up about you, but this is other people, and in a way, I would imagine that's, I don't know, it's like a different experience, right? You're not trying to create a record of your own world. You're just taking things that you like. Maybe say a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I think that, I have always been very self-conscious about the idea of keeping a diary. When I've written things down like that, I think I am kind of thinking of my future self reading it and finding it really precious, or I can kind of psych myself out of writing for myself that way. But when I'm writing down the great thinkers who have articulated the things that I'm going through or that I'm feeling in a way that feels really meaningful to me, then it's more like I'm kind of in conversation with these great thinkers about these ideas or these issues or kind of these urgent, parts of being alive, about worrying about falling in love for the first time, or about relationships with your family, or about ambition, whatever it is. It's a way for me to kind of think through stuff, but in a slightly slant, oblique way, where I don't have to kind of look at myself and what I'm thinking head on. I can do it kind of through the lens of a really brilliant other thinker. Apparently,
some of the inspiration for this, for you anyway, came from we have had the same experience. I'm guessing about 40 years apart, but we both took the famous or infamous, for me, daily themes course at Yale.
You took daily themes too? That's
yes,
wonderful.
Yes,
yeah.
I hated it, but this is something where you have to write something every day. Explain why that led you to a commonplace book.
Yeah, so when I took that class in, I think, 2011. The professor who taught it then, Richard Deming, so we had to write 300 words every day in response to a theme, and we also had to keep a commonplace book. It was an assignment for the whole semester. You had to write down lines from things that you overheard, from things in your life. And it was a way, I think in that class, it was a way of teaching us to listen and observe and kind of clock snippets of conversation or phrasings in reading to help us become a better writer by kind of absorbing those snippets. And I found it really meaningful, and I have done it ever since.
Yeah, I took it like in 1975 or something, and it was horrible, and the TAs would hit us with sticks and stuff. But that's just my problem. That's my issue. Charlie Locke, so great to talk to you. Journalist, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, recently wrote Keep Your Notes app under lock and key for The Atlantic. Thanks for your time. To those of you listening, thanks for your time. Now we're going to ask you for something other than time, something beyond time, perhaps, and that would be for your financial support to this lunatic enterprise that we do here and some of the other more sane enterprises that take place inside this building as well. So, as I always say, very nice people are going to ask you to help with that. So please do.
I'll write it down for you. All that I've lost, I'm collecting my thoughts, and some paper and pencil will do. If you're not listening now, if you're not listening now, I'll write it down.